Of the inauguration of our 13th president, President Judith Huntington, who's with us tonight. President Huntington. We believe in long parties, so we're keeping this one going. Welcome to the second of the inaugural lectures for this inaugural year. I want to be especially grateful to all of the people on the inauguration committee, but for this evening I want to be especially grateful to the committee of the lectures, the lecture subcommittee of the inauguration subcommittee. So would the lecture subcommittee please stand? They're scattered throughout the room, but we are very grateful for the work that they did to help us get ready for this evening. And especially, I'd like to now introduce their chair, Dr. Elena Bront-Neville.
Good evening, and thank you, Joe. Well, wouldn't you know it, the night I had the chance to get the mic in the Sweeney Student Center, I realized that I have a foreign accent and I'm cold. Oh, I got a cold. No, I didn't get the foreign accent over the weekend, but I got a cold over the weekend. So, good evening, everyone. Trustees, faculty, staff, and our very dear students. Welcome to the second inaugural lecture. Why race? Why race and adult education? When civilization is defined, at least from the prevailing Eurocentric perspective, we take into consideration art, we take into consideration science, medicine, property rights, work ethics, and consumer society. But we rarely look at human relationships. If we are to survive as a civilization, we must take time to assess who we are, how we act toward each other, and this evening we are invited to do just that. Take a genuine look at two golden threads in the fabric of our existence, race and education. And again, why race and adult education? Because as President Huntington stated, this is who we are, united and strengthened by the mission. Indeed. What's in a mission? If not, the tape is at work of who we are. So I'm so privileged to introduce the panelists of this inaugural lecture. Dr. Vanessa Sheared, Dr. Juanita Johnson-Bailey, and Dr. Scipio Colin III. So I'll start. Thank you. I'll start with Dr. Vanessa Sheared, who joined Sacramento State University as the Dean of the College of Education in 2006. She previously held the post of Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the College of Education at San Francisco State University and was a professor in the Center for Adult Education. She is currently on the board of directors for the Greater Sacramento Urban League United Way Capital Region Sacramento and serves on the editorial board of several journals. She received a Bachelor of Arts from Wheaton College, a Master of Arts from Louisiana State University in Counselor Education, and an Educational Doctorate from Northern Illinois University. She has held positions as an administrator and counselor in universities and nonprofit agencies. She has given presentations at international, national, state, and local conferences, and conducted research and taught in the areas of race, class, language, and gender, policy and leadership, instructional and funding strategies, and Afrocentric womanistic perspective. She's the author of Welfare Reform, Race, Class, and Gender, The Elusive Quest for Self-Determination. She co-authored with Donna M. Stutz, Adult Basic Education in the Urban Community in the Education and Urban Society Journal. She co-edited with Peggy Cecil of Making Space, Merging Theory and Practice. She co-edited with Dr. Johnson Bailey and Dr. Colin III and the late Elizabeth Pearson and Stephen Brookfield, the Handbook on Race in Adult Education, a resource for dialogue on racism. She has authored several chapters on giving voice and teaching and learning strategies in the classroom. And that's what we like, don't we? As well as within community and higher education practices. I will continue with Dr. Juanita Johnson-Bailey now. Dr. Johnson-Bailey holds a Josiah Meigs Distinguished Teaching Professorship. She's the director of the Institute for Women's Studies. And she's an adult education professor in the Department of Lifelong Education, Administration, and Policy at the University of Georgia. Why did I get Texas wrong? Okay, never mind. Her book, Sister in College, Making a Way Out of No Way, received the Philip Franzen Award for Literature in Continuing Higher Education and the Sadie Mosul Alexander Award for Outstanding Scholarship in Black Women's Studies. She's also the co-author of Flat-Footed Truth, Telling Black Women's Lives, and co-edited Handbook of Race and Adult Education. Dr. Scipio Colin III. Dr. Scipio Colin III is an associate professor of adult and continuing education at National Louis University. She came to National Louis University from North Carolina State University, where she was an assistant professor. She has served on the faculty at Indiana University and Malcolm X College, City Colleges of Chicago. Dr. Colin earned her educational doctorate in adult and continuing education from Northern Illinois University. She has served in a variety of leadership positions in the field, including the African Diaspora Adult Education Research Pre-Conference Planning Committee. She received the Phyllis Cunningham Award for Social Justice Advisory Selection Committee. She served in the Adult Education Research Conference Steering Committee. The Executive Committee of the Commission of Professors is part of the Executive Commission of, Committee of the Commission of, what did I say? She is part of the Executive Committee of the Commission of Professors of Adult Educators. Dr. Colin's research and scholarship focuses, and I know that you'll love this too, focuses on the historical foundations of the field with particular emphasis on culturally grounded, community-based programming and the impact of racism on adult education theory and practice in higher education. Her scholarly work includes articles, book chapters, and 2 recent co-edited books, The Handbook of Race and Adult Education, a resource for dialogue on racism, and White Privilege and Racism, Perceptions and Actions. She has been recognized for her outstanding contributions to the field of practice and research, including being the recipient of the American Association for Adult and Continuing Education Award for Meritorious Service to the Field, and an award for outstanding contributions to the profession of teaching and the field of educational history at the International History of Education Symposium. Yes, these are our panelists. And I would like you to welcome our panelists. The panelists have agreed to respond to questions after their presentation. Thank you.
Good evening. Come on, you gotta do better than that. There's energy in the room. Good evening. All right, that's the way we like it. Okay, first of all, I want to say what a privilege and honor it is for us to be here this evening. I want to say thank you to the Planning Committee for inviting us here this evening. I want to say thank you to the trustees and the students and the administrators for being here this evening. We really appreciate your coming out to engage in a dialogue with us, we hope. And most of all, we want to thank you, Madam President Huntington, for being the 13th president, okay? So we want to say congratulations. So with that said, I have the honor of starting us off this evening. So we're going to start here with me giving you just the agenda for this evening, and then we're going to move over to the table. Because one of the premises we offer in the book is that any conversation on race and racism has to begin around the table. Okay. You're good. I like call and response. That's it. Okay, so let us get started. So there you see we had the picture of the table, and so we're going to move into, this table actually occurred in Jamaica. So it was a table in which a group of folks had asked me to come down and talk about giving voice, but we thought this was just a good table to get us started. Because if you look at the cover of the book, you might be a little confused. That's one of the issues we had with the publishers, but that was the only photo they could come up with that wouldn't cause us to have to pay somebody, I think, for something. So they used, a cover, and we did this presentation when the book first came out. And one of the things that the audience said to us there was, because we used some of the authors in the book, and we had them seated around a table, and they said, now that would have been a better kitchen table to have put on the front of the cover. So, some things you win in the publishing game and some things you lose, okay? But we thought it was important for us to get this book out, so we kind of went with it. We call it the Handbook, but that's not the title we preferred. We rather preferred a kitchen table dialogue, but that didn't sound academic enough for folks. So we said, okay, we can argue, or we can get the book out and get it into your hands and hope that it would be something that you would find helpful and useful to you in your work as well as your lives. So the kitchen table dialogue, our agenda for this evening. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by talking about the purpose of the book. Then we're going to move to our beginning and talk about who are we, because that's one of the premises we make in the book, is that in order to have a dialogue on race and racism, you have to do what? Talk to me. Share yourself, right? So that's where we start. And we're going to share something about our individual perspectives. Then we're going to move to what we call join us around the table, and talking about race and racism ain't easy. And then we're going to move into framing our discussion and helping you begin to think about some questions that you can use in your own dialogues that you might have as you begin to move towards gaining a better understanding and appreciation about others, as well as moving forward to change the way we operate in our society today. So that's what we're really hoping for. From story to action is where we move next, and moving through and beyond the anger, guilt, and shame. And then we deal with the myth versus reality of race and racism. And then racism, an authentic lived experience, because we truly believe that it is about our lived experiences, and that's what we bring to the table and that we must share. We're going to move into conclusions, strategies, and implications, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So with that, we're going to start our dialogue, and we're going to try and do this from that table over there. But know that one of the things that we struggle with in the book, and putting a book like this together, because we said that the key to this was engaging in dialogue, we ended up as editors struggling all the time, trying to figure out, well, how do we do this in a dialogue form, which my colleagues will share in a moment. But found ourselves oftentimes dealing with the technical realities of trying to get the information out and trying to help people tell their stories. And so you're going to see some of that tension tonight, because what we really wanted to do was just to have a free-flowing conversation. But in order to do that, we realized we needed to get some information out first. And so we're going to try to do that, but we're going to try to do that from the table. Okay? All right. So Dr. Johnson Bailey will start first, and then Dr. Scipio A.J. Colin the third. Yes, it is the third. Will come up after that. Thank you.
So one of the first things that we thought we'd share with you is an answer to a question that's posed to us all the time. Why was the book written? You know, we've had people ask us, did you really need another book on race? And after we get past the shock of that question, we have answers. I think answers that are very important. We see books all the time that are theoretical. They're very abstract, and then we see books that are anecdotal in nature. And we thought it was very important to connect the theoretical to the authentic lived experiences, to the reality of what happens to people. You have your macro level, you have your meso level, you have your micro level. Micro level, black man has a hard time getting a taxi cab in certain parts of New York. Micro level. Macro level, very different when you look at the stats of how our lives are impacted by things such as unemployment, levels of education, the things that are at the societal level. So we think that this book provides a holistic understanding about racism. And you'll notice that we always do race and racism, the tandem, because it's very easy to talk about race, a little more difficult to talk about racism. In this book, we try to reframe the focus from the other, because the other is always the center when you talk about race and racism. We try to reframe it to focus on race and racism, which then allows people to come to what we call the kitchen table and have a real talk, so that they can look inwardly and they can look across and then among before they try to push it out to the world and look outward. We tried in this book to provide a conceptual differential between race and racism, so that as a racial group, you could look at your membership, the attitudes, and the behaviors that group membership brings. You know what Peggy McIntosh talks about, the baggage that we all bring, that we bring to this table and to this discussion. We think that this book really allows the person, the individual, to look at one's group and to see how your own group may engage in racist behavior, to see how it occurs on the personal level, the professional level, the social and community level, how it's local and how it's also global. I know one of the things that Dr. Colin reminded me of last night, and Dr. Colin has been my mentor scholar for years. She reminded me that too often people want to just put it on the global, the macro level, and not to bring it to the personal level, so that they don't see how they are in fact part of what's going on. This book also examines the manifestation of power and privilege, of pigmentation and of skin color. So we want you to think of racism as a system that operates globally, and it directs and orders how we live. There are things that you won't even connect to how race might impact that or how racism might impact that, but the system is there, it's ever present. And we think that unlike other books, that our book is really a dialogical discourse between the authors. And so you see 4 black women are missing white male, or you see 3 black women, Dr. Elizabeth Peterson passed, but there were 4 black women when we began this conversation and 1 white male. And we were all brave enough, as Dr. Sheared said, I think she put it politely, she said struggle. We fought. But we fought with love and respect. Dr. Colin.
The salient question is, who are we? So I would ask you to take maybe 5 seconds and just look around the room, which means people in the front, you're going to have to turn around, kind of look back, but just look around the room. It doesn't cost you anything. They didn't charge you for this. So if you want to know who we are, including the editorial collective and our authors, we're you, and you are us. Yes, there were 4 members of the editorial collective that were African American women, and we have 1 Euro-American male, and I see that here. Yes, with our authors, such a diverse variety of peoples of color, from First Nation to First Culture. Every global area in the world we cover to some extent. Because of our 20-some-odd authors, they reflected more than one culture. We were very fortunate that our authors were not culturally schizophrenic. Okay? That they were able to find their grounding. So and to share a kind of historical sidebar, I had a lovely dinner partner who asked, well, how did all of you all come together? We had relationships, the sister scholars and the good girlfriends, as we say. This is a quarter of a century to my right. So we did not meet in the academy as colleagues. We met as students who were struggling. We were both working on our doctorate. As Dr. Johnson Bailey said, 20 years? We met, I had entered the academy, and she was a doctoral student at UGA. So this is not where we happen to be in the same place at the same time in terms of geography, but who we are collectively. We have, since first breath, been in the same place at the same times relative to our experiences with sociocultural and intellectual racism. So that is, give me another.
Amen.
Thank you so much. So that was the kind of core of our collective. And then we met Stephen. And please take this as a teachable moment. We met Stephen as a colleague because we are in the field. But as meeting him as a colleague, we were also introduced to an element of his humanity that somehow, from his vision, covered by the power and privilege of pigmentation, it was something he did not see in the field that he saw in us. Is there anybody that's trying to run with me here? I told you these are my sister scholars and good girlfriends. They don't care if no one else says anything. So the salient point that we wanted to share with you in terms of this editorial collective is that you don't necessarily come together by occupation. You don't necessarily come together by geography. There is something about the indigenous human spirit that when it searches for what is not there, and when it seeks social justice, a line from one of my favorite movies, Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. Well, we came. And what built it were not only our experiences, but the experiences of those who came before us. So in the case of Stephen, he had a significant paradigm shift. I don't want to speak in his name, which I can't, but I saw him shift. And you can see that in his writings, which is why I wanted you all to look at each other. Because you deal with racism, there is a door. And you can deal with it from both sides. Is everybody still trying to run with me? Thank you. Now, in terms of our authors, who are they were to a great extent voices that had not been heard from the effective domain. Of course, they have written, they have taught, but no one heard their spirit speak. Because you don't give evaluations at the end of the class. How did their spirit touch you? So what it provided was that it brought together these elements, us as a collective, and links to other collectives that, as Whitney Houston would say, you have that one moment in time to be all you can be. And it is in that moment of time that you're free. You're truly free. So we have 22 authors, the sister scholar, good girlfriend, and a colleague who was able to fly from one paradigm to another. And that's our book. That's who we are, that moment in time.
So you can see the different people, the different groups that were represented. So as we begin, we're going to tell you our stories. I'm Juanita. And where do I begin? Well, I'll begin in Catholic school, the Vincentian Sisters of Charity. 12 years of Catholic school, and I think the first 8 years, very significant in that it was at a mission school that was in the segregated South. I lived in Columbus, Georgia, but the Catholic schools were segregated because of the laws in the state of Georgia. And so I had to go every morning by bus to Phoenix City, Alabama, where the Black Catholic school was. So then, and from 9th through 12th grade, after schools had integrated, I was born in 1953, by the way. So after schools had integrated, I went to Pacelli High School, which was in Columbus, Georgia. When I say integrated, let me say I was the only black girl in my class for 4 years. So I guess I was the integration, or maybe better put, I was the desegregation. And so I had an early understanding of race because when I was about 5 years old, almost 6, my very best friend, Diane, who would come home from school with the maid who worked across the street, was told, can't play together anymore. It's time for you to go to school. That was my first understanding of race. Flash forward to always being with the nuns who were all white, I also had that other side of the understanding of this isn't all white people. This isn't all people. But I got that systemic knowledge in that moment that Diane couldn't play with me anymore because I knew that none of the women who were enforcing this had the power to change it. Although it was obvious that Mrs. Street didn't like it and that my mother didn't like it, Diane didn't like it, I didn't like it, but none of us had the power to change it. There was a system at work. Didn't make anybody bad people. It was a system that was at work. So 12 years of Catholic school, believe it or not, I went to a Southern Baptist college. Quite a shock. And I will bring you forward now to the academy. I came to the academy very late because, like a lot of adult students, I had a lot of self-doubt. And so I went back to work on my doctorate at 35. My major professor, who was a white male, again, always Catholic school boy, we had a lot in common, which is why we write together so much. But when I told him I wanted to do my dissertation on the experiences of black women in school, and I needed that undergirding of race and racism and the theory, he said, I can't help you, but I know someone who can. And he directed me to Dr. Colin, and we talked for 3 hours on the phone the first time we talked, and I've never let go. You know? It's like when you find a diamond, you don't throw it away. And so she has been my scholar mentor all these years, and she introduced me to Dr. Sheared, and they founded the African Diaspora Pre-Conference, which was where I first presented, and when they first took me under their wing. And so I am literally who I am. I'm the person who has a doctorate. I'm the person who is able to operate in this forum because of the women in my life, the women who have been in my life. They've been Ascension Sisters of Charity, my mother, my grandmother that I write about, and these two women to the right of me. That's my story.
I'm Vanessa, and I grew up in the 50s as well. I'm 56. I grew up in the South, in Louisiana. Unlike Juanita, I started out in Catholic school, but unlike Juanita, they were all black. So I was very well protected. And the nuns were there to tell us what we should do. I remember getting my first, I guess, back then you could get whoopings. All right. In school, right? So I remember that. Juanita said to me as we were walking in, I bet you were the kid who was always getting other people in trouble, weren't you?
Because she got me in trouble today.
But for me, growing up in the South was quite an interesting experience because as a kid, one of my first understandings that racism existed came about as a result of my father, who had driven us to somewhere, and anyway, we had to stop and get gas, and my younger sister needed to go to the restroom, and they only had restrooms for white folks. My father decided that it was okay to go in the restroom anyway, which for me as a kid, I knew that he wasn't supposed to go in that room. And I was quite afraid because I had grown up knowing that colored folks went to the other side of the ice cream, to the back of the area to get ice cream. We went upstairs to go to the movies and all those things. So I knew right then and there something's wrong, but oh, something was so right. Because my father decided that it was right to go in. So for me, it was kind of like that, just because I am a person of color did not mean that I was not entitled to do that which everyone else was entitled to do. Now, I didn't get that as a child, clearly, but I knew enough at that point that something was different about that. So, fast forward, you go off to, I went to Wheaton College. We call it Wheaton College because it is a Christian liberal arts college. It is the College of Billy Graham. Just to give you some perspective of where I went. There were, for the first time, I was truly in the minority. Out of 2,000 students in the university, I think we had 16 folks of color. And know that I'm saying folks of color, all of them weren't African American, okay? Those were the ones who were identifying. So, yes. And so, I remember going into the dean of students one day because he brought me and another African American student into his office to pray for us poor color girls because we were doing something called, we wanted to do something called Soul, you know, create a group on campus, you know, and we were going to do this, and, you know, that did create a little division that said we were not like the rest of our good Christian friends, so that was not good. But it didn't stop me. It was like these were the moments, you know, these moments that you have in time that you go, okay, I can make a difference. And we did. We made a difference. We started that organization on campus. Now, you know, we're sharing these stories not because we're saying you need to know all of our business, but because we think you have similar stories as well. And that's where we think you need to begin, with your story. So let me just tell you most recently, which tells me that we have not moved that far yet. Currently, I serve on the President's Building Campus Community and Unity at Sacramento State. The reason this came about was because of the situations that were happening across the United States with kids, with young people committing suicide, and young people, you know, all the shootings that were going on. So the president decided he wanted this committee, and they decided they wanted to do something around unity. So 3 of us who were just quite adamant that the first thing we needed to talk about was race, because the rest of the folks kept saying, why do we want to talk about race? Why is that important? Our kids don't understand that. And I kept thinking, well, it's not over. We're still living in a society in which racism exists, and that's why these kids are having problems on our campus. We need to engage in these dialogues about what's going on. So we just kept pushing it, and you know, even to this day, the most recent conversation, because we've now had several events. We had Michelle Norris come out and talk about her book on race. We had most recently Eva Rutland come out and talk about when we were colored, and people were saying, well, can we, you know, can we use that title? It's like that's the woman's book title, yes, but the kids don't understand that. Well, therein lies the problem. So we're here to tell you that when I look at all the advances we've made, the fact is we're still dealing with issues of race and racism in our society. And for me, that's why I believe this book is so important, because without it, we continue to ignore that which is causing some of the dilemmas we're having in our society.
My name is Scipio. It's not Scripto. It's not Scorpio. For anyone that's had the opportunity to, it's funny now, it was not funny then, okay, who's had the opportunity to read the book, that was my second encounter with white racism. And that was the first grade. And I had been raised to believe that learning was going to be one of the greatest and most beautiful adventures you could ever have in life. Believe it or not, I was looking forward to going to school. Reader's Digest, first grade, the teacher said we were going to read, and she pulled out, and as I wrote, I know I'm telling my age, the infamous Dick and Jane book. For you young bloods who have never had that experience, this was the context of my encounter. The teacher said, this is our reading. So somebody needs to run with me on this. It reads, "See Dick run." I know there are people here that can bear witness. The next part is, "See Jane run." And the third part is see spot run. So my encounter was, and although I didn't know the descriptive adjectives for it, but you know, I thought this collaborative thing. So first grade, I raised my hand. And I said, in essence, can I bring a book from home? And the book was Black Beauty. And it was like white racism said, let me explain to you who I am. And I may change form, but watch me now. And the first thing my teacher did was to imply that, one, I did not have the book. And secondly, if I had the book, I could not read it. So she kind of covered her bases. If you have it, you can't read it. If you read, you don't have the book. But I am not going to be wrong about you, little colored girl. So kind of skipping forward, you know, my parents came up, my grandmother, my uncles. It was like, you know, people lost vacation time and so forth. And so my resistance at that point was, well, since you're really not allowing me to read, and you're calling me out of my name. So when you take attendance, I will not respond. Because Scipio is not here. My second form of resistance was, when I just decided to stand, I refused to open the book. Now, watch this. See Dick run. See Jane run. See Spot run. Do I need a book for that? They never tell you where these children and the dog ran to. So as I said, I'm going to kind of speed up. But, so that was my second encounter. And this may shock you, but I swore that I would never be an educator. Because of my experiences. And it did not stop because, remember I told you that white racism introduced herself to me. So this was throughout experience. I said I would never be an educator. And I honestly thought that was the most dishonorable profession anyone could engage in, because you hurt the gentle spirit of a child. So I saw no honor in that. But then be very careful about what you say you are not going to do. Because there are those times that, and maybe we need to kind of think about this in terms of the impact and influence of racism, that maybe you have to have that impact so you have an authentic story to tell for those that come behind you, where when you tell it, you can tell it within the context of that old Negro spiritual. I'm still here. I'm still here. I made it through, and so can you. So now to bring up to date. I ended up in the academy. Don't know why, but it's not for me to question. But there was something that I realized, and I think that's how the book has really highlighted some things for me. That with our experiences in encountering racism and the shared experiences of not only us, but are authors. Then we also make a decision, then where do we serve and whom do we serve?
All right.
And I don't know the name of this author, and I am so sorry. But it is that when you decide to tell your story, that there is a commitment that if there is this geographical space or a body of water that can be reflected of racism, sexism, homophobia, don't anybody grab your chest and fall out now, and ageisms, and all isms that we can't even name, that if you can visualize that body of water, you make a choice based upon your story. Where will you stand? Will you stand on the shore? And as bodies come behind you, you start snatching them out. But then there's also another option. And I think this is what we did, and then I shall end my story for the moment. That it is that commitment because there's an unanswered question. Then who will go to the mouth of the river? Because that's where the bodies are being thrown in. You don't want people to leave the shore. But in a way, our experiences at some point will tell us, and normally I speak for no one save myself, but I think I can speak for the three of us on this. It's time to go to the mouth of the river. It's time to minimize who is being thrown in. It's time to say in word and deed, you can't do that to this one. Not this one. So for me, when I say that, I am speaking to little Scipio. Because I'm saying, I told them in the future, there'll be somebody else like you. But I said, you'll not do it to this one. Not this one. So that's part of my story. Thank you.
Is that when the three of us get together, guess who we turn to for some inspiration? Scipio. Yes, we do. You know, and she has, you know, there are colleagues and, you know, there are several others of us out there. And when we get together, we just kind of sit and wait for her to finish telling a story and helping us move forward. So, and that's what we're really talking about, the ability to move forward. It's being able to dig down deeply into our authentic lived experiences, understand them, and then be able to take them and move forward. And that's what we want you to do right now. So we want you to join us in a metaphorical kitchen table. And because we do, and we've said over and over, talking about race and racism, this time is not easy. Remember I said it ain't before, but it's not easy. So what we want you to do, begin to do, and in the book, what we did was we devised a series of questions, and we asked each one of the authors to address these questions. And we're going to reframe them a little bit for you and give you some food for thought with regard to the questions, because we believe that in order to have a real dialogue, you have to be willing to dig down deep and ask yourself some tough questions. Doesn't mean these questions are all that tough, but let me tell you, when we started this project, one of the things we did towards the end, because like I said to you in the beginning, we started out and we had all the intentions in the world of just coming together to engage in this to allow people to tell their stories, but then we said it's not enough for them to just write their stories. They've got to engage in a dialogue with each other. So in each one of the sections, each one of those authors had to participate in a dialogue. And that dialogue was framed around these questions. And at the end of the dialogue, so the book is written as chapters, but you don't know all that went behind it in order for them to come out on the other end, for us to come up with a summary in the end that reflected their real, authentic, lived experiences. And we hope that the authentic experiences leads one to gain a better appreciation and understanding of how insidious racism is in our society. And it comes in all forms, not just in our stories, but in theirs as well. So the questions we ask: what racist assumptions have framed your actions and behaviors? So what we were saying is that racism can be something that is internalized. So we do that, and so as a result of it, it has some bearing on our actions. The story that Scipio shared a moment ago could have led her to all kinds of internalized beliefs about herself or her inabilities, but it didn't. So do you believe that racism is endemic and permanent in our society? You do? Really? Okay. All right. How? No joke. What'd you say? I heard you say something. How have your lived experiences provided insights about race, racism, and sexism, and how it impacts the personal, professional, and social being? Your authentic lived experiences. How might having a dialogue, and this is the key, because this is what we're centering everything around, is that dialogue is key. How might having a dialogue about race, racism lead to a deeper or new understanding about the ways in which we work and operate within our various settings? We're not just talking about in an adult learning environment. We're talking about in your church, in your home, wherever you may be. The thing is, you know, we live in these worlds in which we don't talk about these things. And we're not saying that every time you open your mouth or every time you see someone, you have to have that kind of conversation. But it is something that becomes real important. I taught a class last year, and the student had the Handbook of Race in her office. And a colleague came in, picked it up off her desk, and asked her, why did she have that book on her desk? You know, and it wasn't because he was interested in knowing what was in it, just so you know. He just really didn't think it was appropriate for it to be in the office on her desk. So, you know, we're still dealing and grappling with these things. How can we expand the dialogue so that it enables us to move beyond our entrenched state of distrust and destruction? These are the questions we want you to keep in mind as you begin to think about questions you want to pose to us as we move forward.
So we're going to move you from story to action. We want to examine your understandings of race and racism. History, herstory. And it's really important to understand that history, for the most part, is framed from a male perspective. And so in the late 70s, the term herstory was coined. Now, I want to tell you a little bitty story about what shapes history. Have you heard the story about the young girl who's holding her mother's hand and they're walking through the town square, and there's a statue of a man who's ripping the jaws of a lion apart? And the young girl says, but Mommy, how is that possible? And she said, well, the lion didn't make the statue. Man made the statue. So the person who tells the story usually directs the way the story goes. And so I want to acquaint you with her story, our stories, your stories, the perspective that they're told from. The setting, whether it's the home, the office or the classroom, the invisible table is always there, the table around which you can have a dialogue. And so, we want you to embrace the dialogue by sharing your story, by remembering, by recalling your story, tapping into your authentic lived experiences, and embracing the experiences of others. It's so very important. I know the race work that I do with Ron Severo, people ask all the time, how did you get that trust there? The trust was built, and not once when I went to him to tell my story to say, I just got stopped by the police in the parking lot. And he'd say, for what? And I said, for leaving the building with a laptop, and they weren't sure it was mine. And one of my white students happened by and said, oh no, that's Dr. Johnson Bailey, that's her laptop. So the police let me go. Not once when I told that story did he question what the police were doing. He accepted my story at face value. It's important, if you want others to embrace your story, to embrace the stories of others. And it's important to move past the anger, past the guilt, past the shame, which are so counterproductive. He never dropped his head. He never acted as if he was part of the problem, but yet he never denied that he was privileged by that system. And whether he wanted to be or not, he was part of that system.
We're going to go through myth and reality, and I'm going to, not that it's not important. We are just so organized up here. Have you noticed? That's it. It's going to be kind of a Reader's Digest, not because it's not important, but we do want to have time for interacting with the group. So if you could click on that. The myth, when you're dealing with racism, whether it is intellectual or sociocultural racism, the bottom line is the myth says that whatever this negative reaction is, it is due to a deficiency within you. Either as a result of your racial group membership, and because of your racial group membership, there's a problem with your genes, which impacts on your intellectual capabilities. And because you lack intellectual capabilities, you have no contribution to give to the higher levels of mankind. You all got it? Got it. So it boils down to that based on genes or racial group membership, one entity is superior and another entity is inferior. Now there are a lot of 50-cent college words, but that is the bottom line. I am better than you, not only because I belong to this racial group, that's a because of. But then it's always got to be the comparison. Just in case not belonging to this group is enough, watch this. You're intellectually inferior and I'm not. Just in case the pigmentation changes. See, you have to have a plan B. Okay? You lack that higher spiritual level. And I know God. So when we look at, this is an example of how it plays out. This is what somebody can encounter every day based upon that assumption. First of all, because I'm in this environment of higher ed, I did not expect to see you. How could you be here? And now that I've seen you, I just want you to know, well, you did okay. So it's the assumption, the myth is, you're not capable of being here, but if you show up, I might give you a little something as a positive. And then this particular author goes on to say she had to go into the world of mythology to pull the elements to make this judgment. Because that's her myth, but that's not my reality. But even though you know that's not your reality, it can sting at that moment that it happens. Because an example of that, if you look at what Doris encountered, and we're talking about that sting of it, here she is in an environment with a colleague who happened to have been a white male, giving a test on language difficulties. And after it, the little boy's mother says, "How did he do with that N woman?" You all know the letters of the alphabet, so we don't even have to go there, okay? How did he do with that N woman? And not unlike the author from before, it was not only a sting, but it was this vibration. It was like an echo. You know, myths can beat on your brain and your soul like a drum. And she said, I just felt like I was just in this echo chamber. Because it wasn't just the articulation of that myth that was bouncing off of her, but every assumption that framed that myth. And she was honest. She said, yes, I cognitively understand this. I understand history. We're prepared where you're not always, you know it's coming. You just don't know when. And sometimes the when is what pricks you. Because when you look at her salient thought, after 25 years, a PhD from the University of Virginia, not the University of Mudhole, Mississippi, the University of Virginia, and everything I've worked for, and I've just done a complex and complicated test, and yet I'm still an N woman. Somebody said just
In the next section of the book, where we look at racism and lived experiences, we have a story from Lisa Baumgartner, who's a young white woman. I think at the time Lisa was 35. She teaches at Northern Illinois University, alma mater of my two colleagues. The title of her chapter is White Whispers, talking about race in adult education. And one of the things that Lisa wrote in her chapter was that she can discuss race and white privilege, and people don't assume she has an agenda. And Lisa had co-taught with me, and she always said, in the evaluations, students always said, yeah, but she has an agenda, because changing this is going to benefit her and her group. And Lisa said, but they never assume that about me, but I have race too. I have a race, and I have the same agenda. She said, my credibility as an instructor is not questioned because of my race. The other side of that coin. Now remember, whatever you have, you're talking about the underprivileged. The side of that coin we don't talk about is the other side with the overprivileged, because it has to occur. And Lisa said, so your credibility is always questioned because of your race. But she said, even with this white privilege, I know that it's coming at a price, and I know that that's a price that you have paid and a price that you continue to pay. Lisa also writes in her chapter that when issues of race do surface, most often we're talking about discrimination against people of color, and that there's a silence there, and that whites perpetuate that silence because whether it's known or it's unknown, there is a personal, social, and institutional actor, and that actor is going unchallenged. She said, for the most part, whites do not see race, and not seeing race is beneficial. You've heard people say, I'm just colorblind. And I'm thinking, must be nice, but you also must be in another reality. Because that's not possible on this planet Earth. Louis Kahn writes in his chapter, Immigration, Racial Identity, and Adult Education, that the historical memory of the vanishing Chinese community in his home where he grew up in Peru, that for him there was this cocoon, and that it had been woven for him from the indentured servitude of the early immigrants and from his Chinese Latino community. That there was a cultural and racial mix that was comforting. But oh, he came to the US. And when he did, he never felt more Chinese. And I'm sure those of you who've traveled to different countries, you don't think of yourself here necessarily as an American, but when you get to another country, all of a sudden, you're an American, you get it. Your culture has traveled with you. So Louis Kahn writes that as a Peruvian immigrant of Chinese descent, he grew up with a very complex, a sort of dualistic racial signifiers that at all times sort of pounded racism and prejudice against Asians, and he got that. And so he's able now to sort of translate that into his writing. He has an awareness of an experience of race and racism in the US and in Peru. He's been sensitized to that, and he testifies to that. His identity as an immigrant of Chinese ancestry is something that he lives with every day, whether he's in Peru or whether he's in the United States, whether he's in the cocoon or whether he's out in the hard, cold world. I heard a quote the other day that has stayed with me. What the caterpillar calls the end of the world, the master calls a butterfly.
Right. Well, these are just some of the stories from the authors in the book. We hope they entice you to read more. Of course we do. But more than that, we hope they entice you to begin to not just read it, but to begin to tell your stories, engage in dialogue, and to begin to create change. In conclusion, we just want to iterate again. Change isn't easy, but as we know, it is needed. We want to just suggest to you that as you begin to enter into any dialogue, there's always going to be the question, am I safe? The answer is no. You want to be, and that's why we don't do these things, but we're suggesting that you gotta, as we say, push forward. You've got to do it with some intentionality and understand that the first time you may not get there because the best laid plans don't always turn out the way we want them to. But again, we want to encourage you to push forward, to engage, and to push forward some more, because that's the only way that we're ever going to create the change that we all believe is necessary if we're all going to move into a space and place in which all of our realities are what? Honored, respected, and all those good things that we want to have happen in our lives. So with that, we have some moments here. We have some strategies. We're not going to go do that. We've kind of given you some ideas. We hope that you read the book. As we said, we offer strategies and implications at the end of the book and some things that we think that you can use in a classroom setting or in a home setting. For those of you that will be there tomorrow, maybe we'll get there. So with that said, that's our presentation. So we're going to open it up for dialogue. Yes.
I'd like to share my experience. My experience is similar to yours, Dr. Sheared. My father came from a background of Native Americanism, and he grew up as did many of his
Can you stand so they can see you? They need to see.
He grew up as many of his ancestors did in the state of Rhode Island, lived there for many generations, and a history that he could follow through many generations on paper. He and the Mormons were the only ones who kept those records. Now, interestingly enough, he taught us from children upward that we were Native Americans. None of us got it. 40 years later, I'm just getting it. And interestingly enough, he never backed down to anyone, even through beatings, even through being humiliated. He always told us, stand up for who you are. And while we saw him do it and cowered behind him, I now realize that once you realize who you are, you can go anywhere and do it well.
Thank you for sharing your story. Right here? Yes.
How you doing, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Jonathan Berkeley, and I have a few questions, but I'm going to just ask one, because I know it's a room full of people here. I want to know what your feedback is and what suggestions you have about the internalized hatred of racism that takes place within our own people, to the point that it has really surpassed the institutional, the political, and the social-economic racism of old. At the time that we have an African-American president, it's a beautiful thing to see. On the flip side of that coin, we have such a dynamic, toxic dysfunctionality between men and women of African descent. You know, there is a new height of disrespect and venom that inside of our communities that takes place between black men and women. The way women view themselves, the disconnect from the youth to the aged. And that learned behavior has really surpassed the chains around the necks and the ankles and the wrists that used to be. So I don't want to go on, but I just really want to get your feedback from that. How do we deal with the learned behavior, the internalized hatred from racism? Thank you for listening.
I'll take a stab at it, and then my colleagues can take a stab at that, because it's not like I have the answer. But one of the things that I have theorized about is this whole notion of marginalization and oppression. And one of the pieces that I look at is this whole idea of it, that centers around, if I've been told long enough that I'm not good enough, I ultimately live out that which I've been told. Now, you say that that should be easily broken. But what if everything around you continually tells you? Now, you can say, I made it out. She made it out. You made it out. But there are so many others who never got that belief that I could push forward in spite of what you're telling me. And so I continue to believe in the perpetual story that I can't and I don't. Now, is there a solution? Yeah, I suspect the more we engage in these conversations without attacking them for not being able to, then chances are we'll begin to create an environment and a system in which they can begin to see themselves more fully. Every time I go out, in this past Sunday, I was at a African American church in Sacramento. And the reason that I was asked to come was why? Because they were going to send out the big honchos from, there are 23 campuses in the California system, and we have a chancellor. They were going to send the chancellor out. The chancellor couldn't make it. Then they were going to send somebody else out. And then they were going to send this other white guy out. And then finally, pastor said, do not send anybody out here unless they're black. Now, I don't normally go out to churches to speak, but I got the sense right then and there that it's about the images that people see, who are not coming in to say you're not good enough anymore. Because I think we still have that. We tend to do that to ourselves. So we have to stop telling those stories that we're not good enough or you're not good enough. We have to understand that you live in a context, not by any doing of your own. It's systemic, it's institutional, you didn't make it, you could get out of it, but somebody has to do what? So, like I said, I don't have the answer, but I know that my role is to do what? Lead by example. So if I'm the dean, I'm always going to be looking at making sure someone else is able to come through the door, even when they don't think they're good enough, even if they don't know they're good enough. So there's something there that I have to do, I think, and coming out to do this, that's part of it.
I think it isn't one thing, but it's a series of things. And I think an additional thing is there's a Swahili concept, kujichagulia, which means collective responsibility. It is, and I'm not going to have a Bill Cosby moment, okay, in terms of any response. There is a level where we must assume responsibility. That is the level. We must assume responsibility. I do truly understand what you're saying, but they won't know it if we don't go there. Come on. We cannot assume everybody moved with us. So it isn't just a thing of reaching back in word. It's going home to that community. We can talk about you shouldn't internalize this, but then they need to see those who didn't. There are 8 African American Greek letter organizations, 4 sororities and 4 fraternities. 100 years old. And that's what they do. So it's not just external things. It's not just a single internal thing. It is to physically go where those who have been left behind are. So, that's just another element. And if anyone says, and I know you're not going to do it here, but inside, if someone says, well, it's a lot of crime there. You're talking about internalizing something. Yes, it may be. But the greatest crime is that you don't see that you're the criminal. Right. Because when you leave them behind, you leave a part of you behind. Right. So that's a second kind of way.
Let me just say that it's one of the tenets, and I want to address this. Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm just trying to make sure the mic goes over there when you finish.
And the reason it's so important for me to address this is that I'm a women's studies scholar. And what you're posing, that the strife between black men and black women is new, is ahistorical. It's not new. It's been there since the first one that I know that was written of was back in the first women's movement when Frederick Douglass spoke. There was a tension there because black men eventually got the right to vote, but black women didn't. And so this tension is just ongoing. It's rearing its head in a different form. One of the tenets of colonialism is that you must teach the people that you're colonizing that they're inferior to you. And when you do that, you can control them. And that's why there are all these blacks in South Africa, but they're controlled by a small number of whites, because the tenets of colonialism, of internalized oppression, was there, of course, along with the guns. But what you have to realize is that this is not a new struggle. And Carter G. Woodson wrote about it in The Miseducation of the Negro, where he said, if you teach them long enough that they're inferior, by their very nature, they will go to that back door. And if the back door is not there, they will demand that you put one there for them. And so internalized oppression is present in any colonized people. Then struggle within those colonized people with each other, because human nature, we seek to establish a hierarchy, and we want to be as high up in that hierarchy as we can. So within each sort of marginalized group, they're going to try to establish a hierarchy. And that struggle has been going on since, time and
Okay.
over here.
Right there. And then there's another question right here after
Good
that.
evening. My name is Lucille Williams Parker, and I have a question, and a statement, I guess. I make it a point because due to the fact that in school, I came along with Jane and Mary and Dick and Junk and Spot and all those people. And I never learned anything about me. So I never saw me. I wasn't taught anything about me. I remember Odubai Gorge was a place that my 8th grade history teacher mentioned, and it stayed in my mind. And after we got past the slavery period, that was the end of me. So I made it a point all my life to read, to learn, to go to lectures, and whatever I could find to learn more about me. And the more I learned about me, the stronger I became. And I passed that on to my children. But I find, sometimes I'm amazed at grown folk not knowing about themselves and their past and their present and their future and where they're going, and not taking the time to do so. Maybe a little bit around African History Month or whatever it is. But I made it a point to, I'm an elder now in my family. A lot of my members have gone on. They made their transition. But I make it a point, because I have so many nieces, nephews, cousins, all these young people coming up. It is my duty to inform them of who they are, where they came from, how they got there, and where we need to be going. It is my duty. And I do it as I breathe, because it's just that important. I make it a point in my writings, even here in school. There's not one aspect of life in this world that we cannot touch without touching the African American experience or the African experience, because we were the first experience. If you know that, you can write about it and you can talk about it. But what I'm finding that is disturbing to me is that in academia, I'm having a little problem here. So because you are academics, I want to know what's going on. What is it that the lectures or the understanding of the African experience here in the diaspora or wherever, it's not mandatory education? Because I think if it was, we wouldn't be having these conversations so much around race and so forth. because people will begin to understand how connected they really are. And when we understand the connection from the first world people, which are Africans, I'm sure we all understand that, then we can begin to understand and accept a lot of other people's experiences and how we develop and how we need to move closer together as a world, as a society. But academia needs to address this issue about making it mandatory that people understand the African experience throughout the world, because it is world history. Thank you.
Did you want us to answer that? Just want to make sure, you know, because that's huge. You know, we could look at our institutions and talk about why some folks aren't there and why some folks are. You know, I think our institutions are trying, but as I shared with you a moment ago, you know, our president put together a panel on building community, and people still aren't ready to have that conversation. I sat in a meeting because our president also is doing visioning, and so he brought us all together, and the big question was whether or not we could even talk about social justice or diversity, because I had a young man who was a senior graduating say to me, and he challenged me in this meeting, because I said race and racism exists. He said, prove it. Okay, so, this is someone who's graduating. He's gone through our program. He's had some courses in diversity and whatever those courses are you take in GE. He's done all those things. And so, there's no easy answer to this, to what you pose in terms of the academy. The academy can introduce all kinds of courses. I'm just here to tell you that it's not just something that has to happen in the academy. It just won't. It has to happen in our churches. It has to happen in our homes, like you're talking about, what you do in your home. It has to happen in those social events that we have. And if we just center our conversations around Black History Month, guess what? The discussion will be relegated to, and what will we talk about? What kind of food you eat? Let's bring in a couple of Black speakers and they can talk about something. Costumes.
And a little bit of reggae so we can...
So, there are no easy answers to what you pose in terms of how can the academy make a difference. I am the only African American dean out of 23 CSU campuses in colleges of education. So when I talk and I share my story, they go, that happened to you when you were a child? Yes. So, but these are the people who are doing what? Preparing teachers to do what? Teach your children. So they're not bad people. I don't go around talking about my people being bad because I claim them too. But they just don't get it because their lived experiences gave them a different view of the world. And so while their heart is, I want to help you, and I want to do all those wonderful things for the little children, they don't get it still. So, it's going to take all of us working together to encourage change. It's not just the academy, because I'm telling you, the academy's just not there yet. And there are those of us. How many are you told me you had 5 in your university?
Yeah.
Tenured?
5 tenured African American faculty at my institution. 5. We have no African American or anybody of color in terms of administrators, deans. So, you know, to say the academy is somewhat different than saying what is missing within the educational enterprise. And on one hand, it's human resources, and I'm going to bring this to kind of a snap close. But on the other hand, that's why we stress it is important to have this dialogue, because whether I'm there or not, or a Latina is there or not, or a Muslim is there or not, or a First Nation person is there or not, if a Euro-American is there, if you've engaged in this dialogue and had the paradigm shift, we don't have to be there in person, because you see what's missing by principle and content. So it's, you know, when you say the academy, out of the thousands of individuals who have doctorates, Du Bois said in the 1800s that there would never be more than 12%. See, they teach you wrong about the talented 10th. That they will ever allow to receive a terminal degree. And guess what? In 2012, we have not hit 12% of those who have doctorates. So there is no single thing, and you cannot be everywhere for everybody, but you can have this dialogue. If every person of color left this room, just walked out, don't go far, and there were only Euro-Americans left, if they had engaged in this dialogue and had the paradigm shift, you would not need to be here for them to say, we have something missing in terms of human resources, in terms of curricular content. So if it's a shared humanity, then it's a shared resolution.
And I think the lesson of the civil rights movement, and one reason that it was so successful and yet the women's movement has not been, is coalition building. I remember the civil rights movement, and I'm sure you all do, seeing the rabbis on the front line, seeing the nuns and the priests on the front line. It was across racial lines, and that's why it was a successful movement. One of the things that we've done wrong in the women's movement is that by and large it's been a middle-class white women's movement. We've failed to understand that women globally are half the world and that they don't look like most